Hello and welcome to the virtual IA Symposium, sponsored by FEMA's Individual Assistance Division. My name is Jennifer Bible, and I'd like to welcome you and also encourage you to participate in today's session. Before we begin, we will be going over some logistical information, which Emily Rogers will share at this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Hello, my name is Emily Rogers, and I'll be assisting Jennifer in facilitating this symposium. Before we begin, I would like to share some information to help make for a smoother symposium experience. And please forgive my reading, but there are numerous details, and I want to make sure I get it right. This symposium is being interpreted into American Sign Language and will be captioned in English. Therefore, you will see an interpreter on the screen with the symposium speaker or presenter. If you would like to view closed captioning, it is available live at this link shown on the screen. It has also been included in the chat feature. As a result of the interpretation and captioning, please expect the speakers to pause during their remarks and presentation and the transition between speakers to allow our interpreters and captioners adequate time to rotate during the symposium. To ensure all features of today's symposium are accessible, we recommend using a laptop. All participants will be muted and will have video disabled. We will not be able to unmute any participants during this webinar. Please use the questions box to submit additional questions for the facilitated question and answer portion of the webinar. If you experience any technical issues during the webinar, please send a message in the questions box, and one of our technical support specialists will work with you directly to help troubleshoot the problem. You can also email benjamin.hein@cadmusgroup.com for assistance. Our staff will put this email in the chat now. This webinar will be recorded and posted online at a later date. The link to this recording will be sent to all registrants once it is posted. Throughout the symposium, we welcome your questions and comments. Please use the questions box to ask questions to our presenters. If you'd prefer to communicate with FEMA's Individual Assistance Division outside of the questions box, we invite you to email us directly. Our staff will now drop our email address in the chat. Our email address will also be posted numerous times throughout the symposium for your use and reference. Today's agenda, presentation, and other materials are available to download in the Handouts tab of your GoToWebinar panel. To view the materials, please select the link and download the material.
Thanks, Emily. It's my pleasure now to introduce Kevin Sly, the Individual Assistance Division Director, and Matthew Redding, the Deputy Division Director. They will share some opening comments about our shared understanding and vision for IA as we collaborate and respond and recover from disasters. Kevin?
Thank you. And good afternoon or good morning if you're joining us from another time zone. Thank you very much for your attendance today and joining FEMA's Individual Assistance for the first of a series of 4 IA symposiums. I'm Kevin Sly, the Individual Assistance Division Director at FEMA, and I would like to warmly welcome you to today's conversation. Today's session will cover 2 important topics that have significant impacts on FEMA's many trusted partners. The first being data sharing in regards to FEMA state agreements and a general programmatic addendum. Streamlining and standardizing data sharing with state, local, territorial, and tribal partners is vital to providing effective disaster recovery assistance. In doing so, FEMA has developed pre-approved information state access agreements, or ISA templates, that all states, territories, and tribal governments can utilize. This will make sharing FEMA collected information more effective and quicker. The second topic will cover the National Flood Insurance's program group Flood Insurance Policy, or GFIP, and its correlation to the Individual Assistance Program areas of Individuals and Household Program, commonly referred to as IHP. This grant may be available to disaster survivors during a major disaster declaration and is vital for providing assistance for potential flooding activity in the future. I want to take this opportunity to highlight efforts that are underway to implement equity-driven program delivery consistently and systematically. For example, the way we use our policy and our rules. FEMA has always worked to deliver programs equitably and to reduce unnecessary barriers to eligibility for all disaster survivors. Following President Biden's executive order on support for underserved communities, FEMA evaluated the equity of our programs and processes to ensure assistance is accessible to the people and the communities that we serve. This led IA to amend policies and practices to provide greater flexibility and increased access to assistance for disaster survivors through many policy expansions, streamlined assistance, and acknowledgement that growth in IA programs is vital for equitable outcomes for survivors. In theory, to offer equitable resources to each person is noble, but economically, can the agency fulfill its commitment? FEMA assistance is available to eligible disaster survivors regardless of race or socioeconomic status, and we're always working to improve how we deliver our programs to all survivors. However, systematic and economic barriers can make disaster recovery more difficult. We acknowledge that there's still work to do, and we're committed to doing it. We're working every day to provide equitable access to federal assistance for those who need our help. FEMA is always looking for ways within legal authorities to simplify the disaster assistance process. Many changes that have taken place over the past year have been survivor-driven, based on feedback that is received from many of you. The people that work in emergency management are some of the most dedicated people I know. They commit each day to helping disaster survivors while looking for ways to improve the speed, the accuracy, and effectiveness of the variety of assistance types that may be provided at either the state, local, territorial, tribal, or federal level. I appreciate this time to be with you and look forward to demonstrating our commitment to delivering on the programs that we offer to the state, local, territorial, and tribal communities, and to provide assistance to disaster survivors as resourcefully as possible. And with that, I'll turn it over to Matt Redding. Matt.
Thanks so much, Kevin. I appreciate it. And again, welcome to everybody, and thanks so much for your participation today. This being the first of a new year's worth of symposiums where we can share, collaborate, and update everyone on some of the exciting new programs and points of emphasis that we intend to roll out across the new all-hazard season. It's been very busy, and obviously our nation is still in the grips of the pandemic, and the IA division has taken a lot of steps to make sure that recovery assistance can be delivered as quickly and as effectively as possible, especially to those areas that may have been historically underserved or disadvantaged. In doing so, we've begun to think ahead and leverage, not predictive analysis on where we think damage will be by pre-staging some of our on-site inspectors. We've been using a mix of in-field and hybrid or a virtual deployment for our DSA staff. And we've also taken means to make sure that disaster recovery centers can get set up in a very efficient and effective and safe way, given that the pandemic has yet to release its grip on the nation. This has really helped, pick the right locations for DRCs based on community and other vulnerability factors. It's allowed us to initiate inspections both virtually and boots on the ground effectively to assess the damages that people have, to help assist occupants and residents with verification of their identity and occupancy, and ultimately coordinate with the state, local, territorial, and tribal government officials to come up with solutions that benefit disaster survivors for that particular disaster. At the end of the day, our administrator has said many times that as we build the FEMA that the nation deserves, we tend to meet you and your survivors where they are. And that oftentimes means getting on the ground, getting on the phone with them, and conducting a very detailed and empathetic survivor experience walkthrough. So we're eager to do that. And I think what we're going to go through today are some really critical topics relating to how we interact with folks. And it kind of all begins with that data sharing topic, which is next on the agenda. So Jennifer, back over to you, and we can make the transitions that we need to.
Sure, thanks, Matt. So at this time, I just want to have everyone be reminded that there is a questions box. So feel free to ask questions related to the upcoming topics on data sharing and GFIP. We will try and answer all and any questions. And at this time, if there are questions for our director or our deputy director, feel free to put those in the question box. And we'll wait a few seconds to see if there are any questions. Otherwise, we'll move to the next section in data sharing. And I don't see anyone typing at the moment. So I think it may be best to move on. And then as questions arise during the presentations, we'll be sure to respond to those. So Matt, back to you.
Great, and if we can just queue up the charts on data sharing, I'm happy to launch into this. And as Jennifer indicated, as the Deputy Director for Operations, essentially my portfolio here at the headquarters is oriented on planning, preparedness, and delivery of IA programs to the field through our regions and field offices. The region headquarters is the linchpin, and the regional administrators through their authorities enact and carry out FEMA's nationwide requirements to support the nation before, during, and after disaster strikes. And, you know, it's important to remember that our system is designed on what has become kind of a bumper sticker in terms of local execution, state managed, and federal support to disaster survivors through the response and the recovery process. So what we oftentimes see is that after the wind dies down or the waters subside, that there is an immediate need for data sharing, situational awareness, and oftentimes that includes survivor data, including personally identifiable information, or PII, which is very sensitive and subject to identity theft and fraud on behalf of some of our nation's most vulnerable folks during a very difficult part of their lives. So what we did, if we could go to the next chart, please, is we began to take a look at how quickly we had done this. And again, just a quick overview of what we'll talk about today in terms of our ability to share data immediately with the states for response and recovery operations. We identified some risks. We'll talk about the data sharing and the risk reduction efforts that we've gone through over the course of the past couple months here at FEMA, and then look to partner with not only our regions and field offices that are out there in active disasters and active recovery operations, but improve outcomes and clarify what our rules under the law are for sharing data with the states. And if we could go to the next chart, we'll jump right into it. So in terms of background, FEMA's mission, as stated, help folks before, during, and after. And, you know, at the end of the day, we must make data-driven decisions. A lot of FEMA's individual assistance programs are derived from eligibility and status. And when we take in, whether through our website, the call center, or registration at a DRC, that person's information then is protected by the privacy law, and we, as a federal government, bear a huge responsibility to safeguard that information, protect it from both cyber attack and pilferage. We're also very cognizant of the fact that many people's identities are already, sadly, in the hands of criminals who would seek to register on their behalf and try to defraud the government. We use a lot of very technical means and big data techniques to protect survivors who are very vulnerable. And we also want to balance, the strain that fraud places on our systems so it doesn't affect actual humans who need actual FEMA support. So timely, accurate, and secure data sharing is a preeminent concern of ours as we move into large, medium, and small events with the states. What we ended up figuring out is that across our history, we had, been taking some very rapid and actionable means to share data with our states, but it wasn't entirely compliant with federal privacy law or the regulations at the federal level governing that. So we really put ourselves back into privacy and information law school through the course of a FEMA level privacy sprint. We executed a very quick 8-week project where we revalidated our method and intent behind sharing data. And it was the Individual Assistance Division, along with our FEMA privacy experts, who created a new template for regions to begin to employ with their states for future events. So what we were used to in the response world was a FEMA state agreement that would go into effect upon the declaration's approval by the president, and we would immediately begin sharing data with states. What we've done is we've properly structured that now into our own federal statutes and authorities and lined up behind these agreements, sharing arrangements that have essentially the weight of history for best practices and the most commonly shared data elements in our interactions with state, local, territorial, and tribal entities who need FEMA information. And likewise, we need state gathered information on survivors in an affected area. We can go to the next chart, please. In terms of the risks, again, personally identifiable information, PII, is very vulnerable, during the aftermath of a storm or an earthquake or a tornado. What we found in our analysis is that our existing FEMA state agreements did not explicitly say what we were going to share data for. We used it to make sure that we understood who was in shelters. We understood that as we shared data, we were going to make state level programs available to folks under the governor's authority or under the state's legal authority as a jurisdiction, but it wasn't clearly aligned out as to what this routine use data sharing would do, nor was it clear how it linked back to FEMA's discrete statutory authorities under the Stafford Act would be employed in the sharing of this data. Number two there, very simply, these were very open-ended agreements, and privacy law is very clear that there must be discrete time blocks and a finite amount of sharing to enable the mission, but not to have open-ended agreements so that we would continue sharing data and create vulnerabilities, whether through accident or nefarious intent from bad actors, to where that PII and that information from the survivor could become vulnerable over time if we continue a data sharing arrangement. So we had to fix that vulnerability. Thirdly, the agreement did not explicitly state that data elements, which ones we would use. And so we used the bulk of our analytic capability to figure out the most commonly shared data elements across essentially the last 3 or 4 years of disasters. And we came up with a really good templated format where most states will say, yep, that lines up with what we think we need to know. We did some outreach and customer interface with some of our regional 6 partners in some of last calendar year's disasters, and we kind of pressure tested those against some of the IDA declarations that we were working with and found some really good results. So we need to know exactly which data elements we're sharing and why, and we got a lot of feedback from our FEMA regions, the field offices, as well as the states who were working with us on this. The fourth item here, the agreement did not explicitly state what the limits were. So a state, if we had shared with them, might share within its governmental agencies and sub-agencies for housing or rental or repair type assistance, or they might share with a contractor doing case management. So again, we had to very explicitly develop the level to which and the purpose for which states would use FEMA data, so that again, it was bounded by and linked back to our Stafford Act authorities. Finally, the agreement did not include language that protects against loss, the unauthorized access, or at the end of the event, how to destroy, modify, or get rid of survivor data. So it was very open-ended. It wasn't in compliance with our existing federal privacy law, and we had to really this type of arrangement up. We dealt with each of these vulnerabilities in the new templates. We can go to the next chart, please. So in terms of reducing risk, it's not only reducing risk of spillage and survivor data being compromised, but it's also an attempt to help state, local, and territorial and tribal entities understand that privacy law is a function of operations. We use it in our immediate response as we're going through the response phase of a disaster as people are being sheltered. We use it in the recovery phase as people are seeking housing assistance, rental assistance, or temporary sheltering under some of the FEMA programs. So we had to spell out a very clear privacy coverage framework that streamlined the sharing process so that it could immediately begin upon declaration, and that these FEMA state agreements would be available soon enough, and thus, broaching the topic here in this symposium, so that during the winter months, the blue sky days that we have on our calendars, FEMA can, through its regions, reach out to its states, and as people are updating their state administrative plans, begin to have a data sharing risk discussion in planning for the next disaster. We developed compliance coverage and documentation, including privacy threshold analysis, which is kind of a risk analysis. What would happen with information sharing across the state and to other organizations that work for the state or territory or jurisdiction? And then ultimately, how does that interface with other FEMA programs like Fema and the National Flood Insurance Program? Ultimately, we instituted a FEMA state agreement that has each of these components with a general programmatic addendum that is templated and can be easily filled out. It's one of those point and click menus in a PDF form, very little free text because all the legal analysis has been done, and it really streamlines questions about how to share data and for what purpose. If we can go to the next chart. So outcomes in terms of major updates, we have just, and the ink is still drying on this. It's not necessarily ready for complete transmittal to the field environment at this point, but there will be a deliberate effort to brief regional administrators on the final outcomes, and at that point, FEMA regions will initiate deliberate attempt to connect with their state, territorial, local jurisdictions, and tribal partners to make sure that everyone understands the new templates and what the purpose is, because it look and feel slightly differently than what the traditional FEMA state agreements look like. But the reason behind it is that it was so far out of tolerance with privacy law that many of these changes needed to be done. What, in our terms, for this audience, we really developed some great templates around other needs assistance, financial housing assistance, the transitional sheltering assistance that we offer, these types of programs that are specific to individual individual households program, disaster case management, are now all functionally available and be enacted in current disasters. And we have used these templates for existing and emergent disasters in Kentucky, Colorado, and Tennessee, in order to share data with states using these newly approved, because now we have FEMA legal concurrence and DHS level legal and privacy concurrence in order to facilitate our ongoing mission. So while there hasn't been a grand rollout yet, we are in fact employing these best practices and approved templates right now in active disasters. We can go to the next chart, please. And perhaps there's a lag in the chart.
I believe there is, Matt.
Okay.
We see, at least I see the next slide with data sharing risk reduction efforts.
Yeah, so I appreciate it. It just popped up. Yeah, so what we're doing, to make sure that we're staying on point here, is that we're covering these things in these templates. We'll do a big rollout through the regions here in coming months, and we want to leverage the blue sky time that we have on the calendar to prepare for and get used to, and have general counsels at the state, local, tribal, and territorial level take a look at the legal requirements that have been inserted into this process in order to become familiar with those and begin a discussion about it. Jennifer, we can go to the next chart. Yep, and I've seen this chart before as well. We can go to the next chart. Yeah, and the benefits. Speed oftentimes can be really impactful to vulnerable people after a disaster. So the speed at which we can share data and the efficiency at which we can share data is very compelling, and it helps us develop better programs for helping people quicker in the disaster recovery cycle. It also is focused on really what I would call the 80% solution in terms of the most common data elements shared across the last 4 years of disasters. There's a lot of data science baked into these things, and we're trying to standardize to the most we can those elements that are required for each of our programs, so that there isn't a whole lot of unique and one-off arrangements which can slow down our ability to share data. If we seek common ground in these templated vehicles to share data, we are much better suited to provide timely service to our disaster survivors, no matter where they are. And then finally, ensuring that FEMA is able to achieve, the service delivery and the support to the state and local, tribal, and territorial authorities in a timely manner. So I appreciate you all, taking the time to listen and learn about this. And I think, Jennifer, that should be nearly the end of the deck.
That is.
And I am prepared to take questions and comments, whether it's about what Mr. Sly touched on up front, any of the opening comments, or the data sharing environment in which we operate. It is sad to say that we have seen a significant spike in the most recent disasters regarding fraud, to the point where historic averages, depending on the type of event, have hovered around between 8 and 12% fraudulent applications, to where now we are seeing, in some cases, 20% fraudulent applications, and largely using kind of stolen identities to try and find their way through the system and defraud the government. And this ends up impacting survivors in your states and local areas. And that is something we're very tuned into, and why we're very cognizant of how we must treat data very carefully, because it makes people vulnerable if we mishandle their PII. Happy to take questions.
So apologies before about moving slides backwards instead of forwards, because at FEMA we're a forward nature, not a backwards nature. So just on that, there is one question that came in. Is this data sharing effort similar to the one being done with voluntary agencies? Can you speak to that?
It is. It's a great question. So for instance, we share data in different scenarios with a lot of non-governmental organizations. You can probably rattle them off the top of your head. And, you know, some of the big players, whether it's, you know, Team Rubicon, American Red Cross, Salvation Army, the list goes on and on and on. We do have the ability to share data with them. In some cases, these non-governmental organizations actually perform official functions on behalf of the states in a disaster case management or a casework or a community services type role. So we are able to share data with them. And similarly, these templates exist to be able to share data with these organizations if they're not working with the state. So we are able to branch out from the FEMA state agreement, which is an agreement between the federal entity FEMA and the state, local, territorial, tribal entity and jurisdiction, and engage in data sharing with authorized non-governmental organizations in order to facilitate FEMA's mission. So we do share data outside of official government to government channels and a jurisdictional level. But those are structured in much the same way and have all the same legal requirements and cyber protection requirements that any governmental agency would have. We're not allowed to share any data with folks who can't protect it at a FedRAMP level of cybersecurity. So it's a very good question. We do share data with folks outside the government to help us with our mission.
Great, thank you. We have a couple more questions. The next question is, will ISAAs be signed sooner or at the start of each future declaration?
Yeah, I think the answer to both questions is yes. So I am personally aware that in some cases, ISAAs, these sharing agreements took weeks to be signed after a declaration. So we believe that this templated approach and using the time we have from today moving forward during blue sky calendar time will allow us to familiarize and make people aware that this is a pretty good way to immediately begin sharing data depending on what the state sees developing inside their event. So I think we're going to be able to sign them quicker. I think we're going to have a much better understanding of what data needs to be shared based on the type of event. And, you know, it gives us an ability to adapt if there do have to be some very discrete edits to these types of arrangements and minimize the amount of legal and other review at the federal level to make sure that we're still within the parameters of the privacy law. So we should, you know, be able to see almost immediate declarations made and data sharing beginning, and that is also going to reduce the time for which these ISAA templates are signed between ourselves and the states. It's a good question.
All right, we are rolling on questions. I'm grateful for the participation. So the next question is, oftentimes the FSA is with state entities and parishes which need substantial damage data for CDBG DR funds and have to initiate an ISAA, which takes a while. Will this effort include parishes or counties?
That's a great question. I appreciate asking it. The short answer is it might. So it really depends how FEMA structures its sub-jurisdictional interface. If, for instance, we enter into an agreement with the state and the parish is the actual recipient of federal aid and that's where the data will go, that can be delineated in the FEMA state agreement such that the state of X or the territory of X then designates a county, parish, or sub-jurisdiction as the entity with which they are going to share the data as an end user. That can be added into the agreement so that we understand the audit trail of passing someone's name, social security number, and so forth through a state agreement to the final jurisdiction for use inside that community and with those officials. So we believe that this is going to help frame that type of an arrangement. And the short answer is it really depends on how the state develops its data sharing strategy and how to work that through essentially the region headquarters in your planning and preparedness cycle across the winter months and so forth as we prepare for spring flooding, hurricane season, and the like on the near-term horizon here. So there is a bit of variance across the country. Different states do different things with their counties and parishes and sub-jurisdictions, but it can be tailored to meet that, given that it is a standard template and you can enter in county, parish, city of for the end user for the data.
Great. There are some further questions on procedures, good questions. The next one is, are there procedures across agencies and NGOs to look at the outcome for each survivors based on their recovery needs? If so, is it nested with Sba, HUD, or another agency?
Yeah, that's a great question. The short answer is I think that we aspire to that. That's kind of the holy grail question that we are seeking. And I think if it's a whole different topic. Excuse me while I mute my microphone. I'm about to. I think what we're probably going to have to do to answer that more fully, Jennifer, is take for a future topic our investment in customer experience and how the federal government and the executive order on federal customer and survivor experience is being addressed. I think that will help folks realize that we understand that there are overlapping federal authorities and we want to optimize the survivor's journey through a shelter into housing that's appropriate, and then ultimately, get on the path to recovery using SBA, HUD, FEMA, Department of Agriculture assets. And I think there's still a lot of work to do in that mid to latter part of the recovery journey.
Great. And to kind of further that on procedures, we have some questions about templates. And can the template be modified to meet any disaster specific needs? By that meaning using data points that may not be in all types of disasters. For example, wells versus septic, furnace, replace, repair data points to fill into those templates.
The short answer is to some degree. If there's a requirement for that type of data, it can be added in or appended to the existing template. If it doesn't fall into that 80% solution across the last 4 years of disasters, there might need to be some slight modifications. But the purpose of sharing the data and protecting the survivor's identity, name, social security number, FEMA registration, address, those are the center lane privacy concerns. If we are getting into sharing data that is not PII, that is not as constrained. I mean, we can share planning data and GIS information because it does not contain survivor information pretty handily. And so that has not been impacted in any way. But if there are specific programmatic links, say in the mitigation world where elevation of heaters and so forth is part of the grant or the award to a survivor, then those types of data elements, if they're helpful in executing that program, can be appended to the existing templates.
Great. And I think you touched on this, but I guess just to confirm earlier, have the delays that have been previous in addressing ISAAs for their creation and signature at the beginning of an event, as opposed to the end of the event, which is typical, have those been mitigated against in the planning?
Yeah, I think so, because these new templates are compliant with privacy law and all the regulations that DHS and FEMA have. And I think it allows for the renewal of and continuation of these agreements beyond the templated timeline in them. So I think we have attempted to mitigate much of that. We understand there are currently very old events that are currently going on between FEMA and its state, local, territorial, or tribal entity. And the intent is to not retroactively impose these templates on those, but when we get to the end of that event's existing FEMA state agreement, we will update them with the new template and then, on-ramp these new templates into current events as they stand for some of these long-standing events.
Great. And I know that we're closing in on time for our next presentation. So several questions have come in regarding long-term recovery groups and other NGOs about how to have the opportunity to work more in information sharing. And I think, as you mentioned, that will come out when all of the instructions and information is set out at the agency level. So we look forward to that. And then there are also a couple of questions about what is the blue sky calendar time? I think in recent years, we may not have seen so much blue skies, but
that's fair. And tongue in cheek, I mean, there is no blue sky anymore. That's kind of a classic throwback to the days when hazards were, kind of limited to seasonal effects. We are living in a very dangerous world. And the whole point of recognizing the link between the need to share data now, if you look at just recently, the winter tornadoes in Kentucky, Arkansas, Tennessee, Missouri, if you look at the wildfire followed by ice in Colorado, the immediate need to share survivor data with states and the appropriate jurisdictions is crucial. And that's why we have executable templates ready to go now. The formal rollout will begin shortly once we find, the ink is dry and the legal assessment's finally done. And then I would expect regions with some of the headquarters support will be able to host and take part in webinars and preparedness and planning sessions, so that as you update your state administrative plans for the upcoming all hazard seasons with your regions, this can be part of the formal discussion and everybody gets on the same sheet of music before what happens next. It could be tomorrow, it could be hurricane season, depending on where you are. That's a great point.
And this will be our last question. Just as a reminder, we will be capturing all questions and responding to them in the forthcoming report, but just for time's sake, this will be our last question for this section. And it is, will there be a separate agreement developed for the disaster case management program? And if so, would this separate agreement be between the disaster case managers and the state, or will it be between the DCM managers, the state, and FEMA?
Yeah, again, great question. And I think that too is going to depend. I am proud to say the disaster case management program statement of notification and statement of record and notification just published to the Federal Register. Jennifer, we can provide that link to folks so they can look at it and comment on it. But this too was something that had been outside of privacy law for a long time and is now compliant with privacy law. And I think it will depend on how the state structures those program elements and how the state designs its data sharing elements to enable disaster case management in the future. Great,
thank you. Thanks so much, Matt, for your sharing of information sharing and FEMA state agreements. I will now turn it to Emily to introduce our next speaker.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you, Matt. I would now like to introduce Freda Copeland, Chief of the Direct Service Agent Branch, in FEMA's Federal Insurance Directorate to discuss the National Flood Insurance Programs Group Flood Insurance Policy and how it collaborates with the Individuals and Households Program. Freda, over to you.
Thank you, Emily, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me today at the first IA Symposium of the year. As Emily stated in my introduction, I'm the Chief of the Direct Service Agent Branch, which oversees the NFIP Direct, FEMA's flood insurance company. Federal Insurance has had a long-standing relationship with IA, and our coordinated efforts on the group flood insurance policy, better known as Gfip. This policy is not one that can be purchased directly by the public, but it is a policy as a result of a presidentially declared disaster due to flood. So can we go to the first slide, please? Thank you. IHP applicants that do not have a flood insurance policy, who are owners or tenants of a residential building and have incurred flood damages to their home and or personal property, may be eligible to receive a GFIP. The GFIP is a 3-year policy and will begin 60 days after the declared disaster. IA will provide a list of those individuals to the NFIP Direct, along with appropriate premium funds, which is currently $2,400 per submitted policy. Upon receipt of the eligible award recipients, the NFIP Direct then has an additional 30-day waiting period before the policy can be made active. This is according to insurance requirements as stated in the standard flood insurance policy. Next slide, please. GFIP certificates are equal to the determined IHP limit for the year of the declared disaster in which it was awarded and currently sits at $75,800. There is a standard $200 deductible set. As previously stated, Federal Insurance collaborates with IA on the GFIP process. However, there are 4 states that work with the NFIP Direct under the Other Needs Assessment, the ONA program. Texas, Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Washington will provide the necessary information to the NFIP Direct to set up a GFIP. It should be noted, regardless if the GFIP is received from IA or one of the ONA states, that it cannot be canceled. However, a standard flood insurance policy may be purchased. Once a policy is purchased, then the GFIP must be voided as duplicate coverage is not allowed. Next slide. Not all grant recipients can receive a GFIP. There are eligibility requirements that must be met. The property must be in a special flood hazard area and in an NFIP participating community. There must not have been a previous requirement to maintain flood insurance on the damaged property, and an application to SBA must have been denied, or FEMA did not require an application for a disaster loan, which then makes the applicant eligible for ONA. Those requirements, as well as other IA guidance, can be found in the IA Program and Policy Guide, the IA PPG, which I'm sure you all are familiar with. Next slide. Okay. Both owners and tenants of a property are eligible to receive GFIP. First off, the owners. They will receive coverage for both real and personal property and are required to buy and maintain flood insurance for the life of that property, at least in the amount of the grant award that they received after the expiration of the GFIP, to stay in compliance with the National Flood Insurance Reform Act, regardless of ownership. So if the property is sold, the new owner is required to have flood insurance. That is it. For the life of that property, there must be flood insurance. There are various options in purchasing flood insurance, including going through the NFIP Direct, which is FEMA's insurance company, going to one of our Write Your Own insurance companies that participate in the NFIP, or through a private insurance carrier. Any one of those options will satisfy the obtain, maintain requirement. It must be acknowledged that there are consequences if a flood insurance policy is not purchased. Unfortunately, the property owner may no longer receive further IA assistance for home repairs or personal property replacement. So that's why it behooves them to purchase a flood policy. Next slide, please. GFIP is a little different for the renters. In order to receive a GFIP, the tenant must advise FEMA of their intent to return to the damaged property within 6 months from the date of their earliest eligibility letter. Just a note on this requirement came about as originally renters were given GFIP upon award similar to the property owners, but we found that not all renters were returning to the damaged property, and thus a GFIP was in place for a non-existent tenant. We found a tenant who, after the flood, had moved to California when the property was located, I believe it was Texas. They didn't let us know, and we had a GFIP set up for them that sat there for 3 years. So after certain discoveries, the requirement of you must advise FEMA if you are a tenant within 6 months from the date of your earliest eligibility letter that you are returning to the damaged property came into play. As the IA award pays for personal contents at the flood damage location for the tenant at the time of the disaster, it is not transferable to subsequent renters or to a new rental address should they move. So if a new renter comes in, they're going to bring their own property. That GFIP cannot cover them. If that tenant moves and takes property elsewhere, because that GFIP was for that property address, that GFIP will not follow that tenant. Next slide, please. Now that we've discussed the GFIP requirements, eligibility, differences between property owner and tenant, let's look at some of the overall statistics for GFIP since its inception in 1996. Federal Insurance noted that in 2019, retention for GFIP ran slightly below 5%. This is a significantly low percentage based on the fact that there is an obtain maintain requirement for GFIP. Consequently, we focused on retention efforts over the last 2 years and increased that retention percentage to 13%. Note in the table on our slide that we have had 132,617 total GFIP since 1996, and currently there are 17,353 total standard flood insurance policies active, which equates to the 13% that I mentioned. Historically, there have been 31,860 standard flood policies, which is the 24% noted on the slide. So we can see there has been a decline in the overall. We tend to see a purchase after the first year of GFIP expiration, and then the policy will lapse after that first year because standard flood insurance policies are only for 1-year terms, and then no further policies are purchased or they do not renew. Unfortunately, we are unable to know if private flood insurance policy was purchased in its place. We can only know those standard flood insurance policies through the NFIP. Next slide. Those were our statistics for retention, but you may ask what retention efforts were taking place or are we doing right now? We have been providing colorful buck slips in all of our GFIP communications over the 3-year life of their policy. GFIP certificate holders will receive a welcome packet, a letter at each anniversary, a reminder 45 days prior to the expiration of the GFIP, and a final notice once the policy expires. Each communication advises of the obtain maintain requirement, so they are well aware. There is a huge rollover initiative that took place in fiscal year 20 in light of the expiration of Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria GFIPs. Remember, those storms took place in 2017. So in 2020, that 3-year expiration came about. Any GFIP that incurred a claim, since we had all the necessary property information, we were able to create a mock renewal bill and provide optional coverage and premium amounts to purchase a standard flood insurance policy. so they could actually see what it would look like if they got a standard policy. Another initiative that we took, the direct branch, is collaborating with marketing and outreach on community-based flyers. Those can be distributed by hard copy or electronically in the field in hopes to bring awareness of potential future flooding and the need for flood insurance. In the same realm of marketing and outreach, we're looking to gain social media presence on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook by connecting with certificate holders and potential agents. We find that many of the regions, some of our state affiliates, they have Twitter accounts. We know FEMA has LinkedIn and Facebook, so we want to utilize that social media. Everybody's out there looking, why not bring GFIP to light on social media? Finally, to assist with understanding the why behind the low retention rates in spite of the obtain maintain requirement, GFIP surveys will be sent 1 year after the GFIP expiration to get a better understanding of why a flood insurance policy was not purchased and what potentially can FEMA do to help. As it stands now, we are not sure. We can only guess as to why policies not purchased, looking at some of the areas where GFIP is prevalent, but we want to know and hear directly from those past certificate holders. What can FEMA do? How can we reach out and how can we assist? So our retention efforts continue. Not only in the past, we're taking some of those to become standard processes, such as the mock renewal bill, and we look to continue our retention efforts to assist with that obtain, maintain requirement. There's nothing worse than having one of our disaster survivors coming to the IA table and finding out that they're not eligible for assistance just because they did not purchase or receive a standard flood insurance policy. So that's it. Thank you so much for your time today. And I hope that this presentation assisted with the understanding and relationship between IA and the NFIP. And I am open to questions.
Thanks, Freda. We do have a few questions and also encourage participants to add questions to the question box. Our first question asks if you could discuss a little bit more about returning funds that will not place a requirement of flood insurance. So is there a requirement there, or to discuss that a little bit?
Right. It has amazed me. If an applicant comes to the table and they get their grant award, and then they find out that they're required to have a GFIP and then have coverage for the life of their property, we have found quite a few people who are like, no, I don't want to do this because I don't want to have a policy, and they can return their money. If they return their money, then there is no obtain, maintain requirement because they did not accept any FEMA assistance. So we won't have a GFIP, one is never set up, and we actually will not know about those folks. It normally happens prior to the GFIP coming over to the NFIP. And on the IA side, I'm sure some of the folks maybe on the phone who have worked with, people are like, oh, I get this information on my letter. I have to have a policy for the life of my property. No, thank you. I don't want it. And they'll return it. So there is no obtain, maintain requirement there.
Thank you. And I know you touched on this in your last slide, but we have a question that says, has outreach increased to understand at like a home buying event or even a school event under the auspice of financial literacy or planning to understand that insurance is not an option and essential, especially in those state-prone disaster-prone states?
Yes, and like I said, I did touch upon that, and we are reaching out. We want people to know, because some of the folks think, oh, I had my big flood. Oh, I had my Hurricane Harvey. I'm not going to have any more flooding, so I'm good. I'm not even going to worry about it. But we all know in those prone areas where we have the largest amount of GFIP, which of course tends to be Texas, Louisiana, Florida, and in the Carolinas, we're reaching out. That's why we're having these social media. We're working with marketing and outreach. We're having these flyers, and our regional offices are working with us on those flyers. So when they're meeting with state coordinators, when they're meeting with community officials, they're sharing these flyers, whether it is a hard copy to actually pass out at a meeting, or because everything is so virtual today, if it is a soft copy electronically that can be shared. We want to get that word out. You need to have insurance. So I hope that answered that question.
Great, thank you. We have another question. Normal in, my apologies, I just lost my place here, just one moment. Normal insurance policies allow monthly payments. Would it be possible for NFIP to allow applicants to make monthly payments rather than requiring the whole premium upfront? This would increase retention rates.
Oh, and I totally agree with you there. However, because the standard flood insurance policy under NFIP, is statutory, regulatory, and we have requirements under the CFR. We actually are working on that. There are discussions and a project team that is looking into, a payment plan, installment payments, just like you have for your auto, just like you have for your homeowners. But we are in the early stages of that, and further discussion and announcements will be made as we move along, but we will have to go through regulations on that one.
Great, thank you. Our next question here is, are there any lessons learned or best practices you could share about how new property owners could be made aware of any GFIP requirements as a result of an IA award to the previous owner? For example, recording it with a deed.
Oh, I could get on my soapbox here. The advice is up to states to tell whether or not a property is required to have flood insurance or the flood history of it. And if it's not disclosed at that closing table, or if it's not shared, unfortunately, I don't know if there's a penalty on that. I know the state of Texas, right after Harvey, they had initiated the real estate. You have to let people know about a flood history. You have to let people know if there's an obtain, maintain. That would be my biggest thing. I have so many people who have come and said, I couldn't get assistance at the table. I don't understand. I didn't own that property back then. I didn't know there was an obtain, maintain requirement on this property. I might not have bought it. And I think that's the fear that people have, that they will have a problem selling their property because of that obtain, maintain requirement. But if, and I don't know how to go about that, because we do have to go through states. It is a state thing where advice on a history, a loss history on a property. If that was a requirement, if you went to that table when you went to purchase that property and you were advised that you had an obtain, maintain, you would be in a better position. Does that answer the question? And again, that's my soapbox.
I believe so. And just to follow on to that, we talked about outreach a little bit, and the participant followed on just to encourage just-in-time training if that's possible, because it's extremely important to have that financial literacy with regards to GFIP and NFIP for homeowners and home builders. So just I want to close the loop on that. Next question is, what is the time frame for homeowners to purchase GFIP insurance?
Okay, before we go to that question, the person that wanted to close the loop on that, I did want to say, as far as understanding and literacy on the GFIP and the obtain, maintain, we have done some wonderful collaborations with the regions. Region 6, Region 4, and Region 2 when we had hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria, where they went out and did radio ads. They held classes in the communities. They went out door to door in those regions to talk to people, to educate people, to talk to agents and get them understanding. So we do work it. We're trying to get that word out as much as possible. So I just wanted to put that out there, how everybody's collaborating on that. As far as the time frame for the next question, we do it just like we do a standard flood insurance policy. So if your GFIP expires on October 25th, you have 30 days. There's a 30-day grace period for you to purchase a standard flood insurance policy. So you do have that standard grace period that is given to all of our flood insurance policyholders.
Great, thank you. Related to that, our next question, are there any considerations being given to low-income households who may turn down FEMA assistance because they cannot afford to maintain an NFIP policy as an issue of equity from, I guess, the equity?
Right, that is a concern. Now, unfortunately, on my side, on the insurance side, if someone were to turn down a grant award at the IA table, and I'm using that generically, the IA table, I wouldn't even know who they were. I only know them if they end up with a GFIP because, you know, we're the federal insurance side of the house. If they turn it down and it has never reached us, it would not be known to me who they were. For those people who do have a GFIP, and that's one of the things we want to do with our survey. Why didn't you purchase that standard flood insurance policy? If we're finding out that it is financial, and you know, our thought is looking at some of the communities that have the GFIP, that could possibly be the situation. If we're finding, what can we do? If our number one cause, if we're finding out from the surveys that 80% of the people say, I cannot afford it, what do we need to do? On the federal insurance side, unlike grant, you know, our policies are based on paid premiums. But who can we collaborate with? Is there something additional that we can do with IA? Is there something that can be done with other areas in FEMA or some of the NGOs that could assist in purchasing or assisting those policyholders in need to help them continue their obtain, maintain? So that's a thought, and I think that GFIP flood survey will assist us in knowing exactly where we stand and the why.
Great, thank you. And I think there's a comment here, I guess, maybe for confirmation that Florida may be the only state that has the requirement to let the new owner know that there's a flood insurance requirement.
Okay. I don't know each state. I believe, yes, Florida, but, and I think Texas may have passed it or was in the process of passing that back in 20 or 21. 2021. Yeah, I think they made that known because I do, you know, because Texas is our own state and I do get to talk to them. So I think they did pass that as well. But we do have 50 states and other territories. And if all of them aren't on that same page, then we do have new owners who aren't aware.
Okay, so we'll follow up on that and make sure we know the states. And next question. Can they, and I'm not sure who they is, but Freda, you probably know, elect to get a policy and decide to be underinsured due to not being able to afford the policy? So I guess they is homeowners.
Right. And the one thing about standard flood insurance that's different from homeowners want you to be, you know, insured to your risk. The standard flood insurance policy, we want you to get a flood insurance policy. The one thing that we have to remember here is that the requirement is the minimum amount of insurance that they have to have is the amount that they received from their grant. So if they got, I'll just make something up, they got $10,000 and they need to have a $10,000 flood insurance policy. We will not penalize them because their house is worth $100,000. They will have a $10,000 policy. The only thing is they need to think about if they have a subsequent flood, how much is $10,000 going to cover in your home? That's pretty much your floor and your carpet, depending on what type of home you have. You're going to, maybe your air conditioning unit, your HVAC, your utilities are damaged, clean up. That's going to run you well over $10,000. Just so everyone knows, the average flood claim payment for insurance runs about $33,000. So where does $10,000 sit? But yes, their minimum requirement is to purchase the amount of the grant that they received. So they could be underinsured. And there's not a penalty, but it is a penalty to them when they do have a claim.
Thank you, appreciate that.
Mhm.
Next question, is there any statistics sorry, on the percentage of individuals who actually purchase flood insurance once the GFIP expires?
Yes, that was, if you could turn back possibly, that was that little chart that I had. We can go back right there. That's the chart. That's the high summary chart. So if you look at the overall, since 1996, we've had 132,617 GFIP. Overall, there have been, in that third column, historically, there were 31,860 people who actually purchased a standard flood insurance policy. That's 24%. Today, we only have 17,353 active standard flood insurance policies. So people have, but not anywhere near where it needs to be.
Understood, thank you. And one participant asked if NFIP would assist low-income families. That would be a grant that an agency could offer.
That would be something wonderful. If there was an agency that could assist with purchasing flood insurance policies for someone, that would be awesome. The flood program, we don't say, who's paying your flood policy? We're happy that someone is buying a flood policy for you. We have had discussions with some of the states where they have had some funds, and we're looking in to see if that was a possibility. They couldn't do it, you know, continually, but at least for maybe a couple years after the GFIP. Those were discussions. There hasn't been anything solid that's been put into play yet, but there have been discussions on that. But we are open, and the NFIP Direct is willing to work with an agency who is interested in purchasing flood insurance for GFIP certificate holders after their certificate expires.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I don't see any further questions. So at this time, Freda, thank you so much for your presentation. And I think it was very valuable considering all of the questions that we were asked, or you were asked of. And so at this time, I would like to bring Matt Redding back for some closing remarks.
Thanks so much, Jennifer, and thanks so much to Freda and all the presenters today. Really appreciate everyone taking part and contributing to this. We look forward to closing out the questions that were left in the chat. We'll do our best to do that in a timely manner. And I really do look forward to the future sessions. We've got another symposium coming up, I think, Jennifer, in March, May, and July. So as the advertisement for this goes out, make sure that folks get the word. And then ultimately, you know, as we look toward future events, we need to use the time we have very wisely. And we're interested in topics where, you know, regions and their state and local and territorial tribal partners can present to us. And it's not just a headquarters down type of perspective. We're interested in topics and participation from the general IA Symposium family, and we look forward to taking your suggestions and having you tell your stories out there and share with the community best practices and so forth. So Jennifer, if you've got any admin notes or updates on timelines for the future, turn it back over to you, and thanks for everyone for participating.
Thanks, Matt. Appreciate that. And just as Matt said, we will be having 3 future symposiums this year in March, May, and July. And just want to encourage you to work with your regional partners if you are a state or territory that's being represented today, and that we will have the recording available as well as a report. And once that is available, we will post it to fema.gov and also send out a notice to everyone. If you do have any questions, the Office of Regional Field Coordination within Individual Assistance is here to support you and serve you. So the email here, you can email us with any additional questions or subject matters you want to see in one of the future symposiums. So with that, I know that we're ending a little early today. We will stay on the line here if anyone has additional or other questions or comments for us before we end. So before we end. Otherwise, we look forward to seeing you in March, but we'll hold the line for a little bit longer, but also yield 15 minutes back to you. And I see Kevin just joined us again. I don't know if you would like to mention anything, sir.
No, great presentations by Matt and the GFIP presenter. I really appreciate the information. This is kind of like my in brief too. So thank you for everyone attending today. And I never left. I just wasn't on camera. Thanks, Jennifer.
Appreciate that, Kevin. And I'm just looking through the comments here. Just again, appreciate your participation in this, and we look forward to the next 3. Enjoy your evening, everyone. Take care.